And it is 7:01, so you know what? I think let's officially get started.
Sure.
So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the second installment of our Beyond Bytown virtual talk series. My name is Steve Mattiusi. I'm the Bytown Museum's Manager of Visitor Experience, and I'm joined again tonight by our museum's programming assistant, Meredith Egan, and of course, our guest speakers from the Ottawa Jewish Archives, Tegan Goldsmith and Marika Friedrich. So before we get going, as usual, I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. The city of Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory, and the peoples of the Algonquin Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this place. As I mentioned, this is the second talk in our Beyond Bytown series. It's a series that seeks to bring to light stories that are either more contemporary or haven't received as much attention as they perhaps should, or both. Our talk tonight will focus on the history, identity, and stories of Ottawa's Jewish community. And to talk about this, we are pleased to be joined tonight by two wonderful speakers. Tegan Goldsmith has worked at the Ottawa Jewish Archives since November 2019. She holds an honors bachelor degree from Trent University and a postgraduate degree in museum management from Fleming College. Her main area of study over the years has been regarding the Holocaust. She has worked in a number of historical institutions, such as the Whitchurch Stouffville Museum, the Diefenbunker, and I think I've heard of this place. I think it's called the Bytown Museum.
You are correct.
Oh, excellent. Marika Friedrich is a student in the Cultural Heritage Conservation and Management program at Fleming College. She's currently a student intern working on the preventative care and management of the photographic collection at the Ottawa Jewish Archives. And she would like everyone to know she is honored to help make these photographs accessible to the community for many years to come. Now, before I hand things over to Tegan and Marika, I'll quickly give an overview of tonight's events for everyone. So our guests will start things off with their talk, which will be followed up by a discussion period between myself, Meredith, and our two speakers. And finally, we'll top things off with some audience participation. So if throughout the evening you think of a question you'd like to ask our speakers, please do not hesitate to type out your question in the chat, which you can access via the button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Also, if anyone has any personal stories to share, after the discussion period, you can always use the raise hand function, which is found under the reactions tab, also at the bottom of your Zoom window. That will grab our attention. Or you can post in the chat that following our discussion period, you have a short story you'd like to share with us. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. And thank you especially, of course, to Tegan and Marika for agreeing to participate and to share their knowledge and the Jewish Archives treasures with us. And with that, I will hand things off to Tegan and Marika.
Wonderful. Well, and thank you again. We're very excited to be part of this. My name is Tegan Goldsmith, and I'm the archivist at the Ottawa Jewish Archives. This evening, I am joined by my colleague Marika. We've already had our introductions, and she will be helping present with me this evening. The presentation will be split in half with me giving a small taste of the history of Jewish Ottawa, and then Marika getting into the fun stuff with the businesses in the byward market. This is intended to be a highlight history and by no means the entire picture. If it was, we would be here all night. I do encourage anyone who has stories or info that they would like to add to please feel free to do so after the presentation and the discussion. After all, this community is a collective and we only get the full picture when everybody contributes. I'd also like to take a moment and thank the Bytown Museum for giving us the opportunity to speak tonight. We are a very small community archives, and giving us a platform to speak about what we do and just tell our history is a really great support to us. So thank you from the bottom of my heart. All right, so let's get started. So when the Bytown Museum approached me about doing a presentation on the history of Ottawa's Jewish community and said I only had 30 minutes to speak, I didn't really know where to begin. This is a massive topic. Jews have played such a rich role in the development of Ottawa and its history, and I really had to sit and think about what to talk about to really get the story across. So I decided that the easiest thing to do would just be to start right at the beginning. So although this topic is up for debate, it's believed that Ottawa's first Jewish settler was Mr. Moses Bilski, and that he arrived in the valley sometime between 1857 and 1889. Moses was born in Lithuania on December 10th, 1829, and first arrived in Canada with his father when he was 14. The two first settled in Montreal, where there was a small Jewish community already established, before then moving on to Kemptville, which is about 40 minutes outside of Ottawa, where they lived until 1857. In 1857, Moses' father decided he wanted to spend his remaining years in Palestine and left his son with relatives in New York. Moses spent the next few years floating around North America on various adventures, living in Ottawa multiple times along the way. Moses played a fairly pivotal role in the development of the Jewish community. For one thing, he was the first Jew here, but his presence did help to pave the way for more newcomers. In fact, the entire Bilski family was pretty central in establishing the Jewish community. They were big supporters of new families arriving in the area, helping them to become established and to find work. In fact, Moses' daughter Lillian, whom many of you know as Lillian Freeman, was extremely involved in the community. She was a huge philanthropist, working in organizations such as the Red Cross, the Jewish War Veterans Committee, and she was the president and founder of the Canadian Hadassah. In 1921, she also went to Europe and brought over somewhere between 146 and 151 Jewish war orphans from the Ukraine and found them homes with Jewish families in Canada. She and her husband Archie also ended up adopting one of these children. You may also know Lillian as the Poppy Lady. She was the woman who brought the Poppy campaign to Canada and the reason we wear poppies every year on Remembrance Day. It is also rumored that the very first poppies were made in her living room, right here in Ottawa. So at the time, Ottawa wasn't really a huge immigration spot for Jewish families. People tended to settle in larger cities like Montreal and Toronto, which had larger, more established communities. However, in 1926, Ottawa's Jewish numbers started to pick up and more families began moving to the nation's capital. For the most part, Jewish families moved into the lower town areas with more wealthy newcomers moving into the Sandy Hill and Rideau Street areas. Because of proximity, this meant that for many years, Jewish businesses tended to dominate the Byward market. Many who came overseas first worked as peddlers until they had enough money to rent or purchase a building to house their business. There were a number of organizations in Ottawa that made settling into their new home a lot easier. For one thing, there was the Ottawa Hebrew Benefit Society. It was created in 1912 with the sole purpose of providing aid to new immigrants. They had a health insurance plan for men and their spouses aged 18 to 45. The Benefit Society also sent out cards to its members during good times and bad. So births, deaths, bar mitzvahs, weddings, so on and so forth. And the benefits, and they even held fundraisers, helping to raise funds for the community as well. There was also Axia and the Ottawa Hebrew Free Loan Association, who both allowed their members to borrow loans in order to help establish a business. The Axia group allowed for larger loans with small manageable payments, usually made on Sundays, whereas the Free Loan Association allowed for smaller loans with a maximum of $1,000 with little to no interest involved. These loans were how many managed to go from peddling to store owner within their first few years in Ottawa. The Free Loan Association also helped people to find jobs. In the early years, when Moses first arrived in the city, there was no place of worship for Jews. For a couple years, gatherings were held and hosted by Moses himself, either in his home or in his daughter Lillian's home. The congregation was known as Adath Jeshurun. Moses is actually credited with acquiring the city's first Torah in 1892 and bringing it in from New York. In the early days, when there were just a few families in the city, services at the Bilski home worked out just fine. But when more families started to move to Ottawa, they began to outgrow their space and began seeking a different location. In 1895, the congregation bought a small wooden building located in the Byward Market at 264 Murray Street. This location, however, did not last long. As it turned out, the building next door was a food processing plant and their staple product was pork and beans, which, as you can imagine, made for a less than ideal situation next to a synagogue. Luckily, in 1893, a few years prior, a plot of land had been purchased for the building of a synagogue. In 1904, the plans for the building had been completed for what is now known as the King Edward Street Shul. The building is a 3-story red brick building with 2 large onion-shaped domes on the top that resemble architecture commonly used in mosques and Eastern Orthodox churches. The window shapes, which you can see from the photo on the screen, is shaped with a square bottom and a rounded top so that they are intended to resemble the 10 Commandments. The inside of the synagogue consisted of a vaulted white ceiling, ornate hanging lanterns etched with the Star of David, and a second floor balcony made of steel banisters and wooden columns. The balconies opened up to the east, where the morning light would pour in through the stained glass windows towards Jerusalem. This is where the Torah, the Jewish Holy Scrolls, used to sit. The balcony was where the women would sit when they were there, and the men sat below in the main sanctuary. During the first half of the 20th century, Adas Jeshurun served as the principal Orthodox congregation. However, in 1956, the Adas Jeshurun congregation and the Agudath Achim congregation joined together to form the Beth Shalom congregation, which was located on Chapel Street. Because of this amalgamation, the King Edward Street Shul became the Jewish Memorial Chapel, also known as the Chevra Kadisha, please pardon my Yiddish, which provided funeral services for the community. This building remained in the state until it sailed to the Seventh-day Adventist group in 1997. This is actually, you can actually still visit this building today. It still has that beautiful big Star of David window. They never took it down, and it is still in the same spot it was 100 years ago. So talking about the Jewish community would not be complete without addressing the warriors in Ottawa. The warriors in Ottawa were much like in any other city in the country. When Canada declared war on Nazi Germany in 1939, men across the city began to enlist. The Jewish community was no exception. In fact, when war was declared, the Jewish community took it upon themselves to ensure everyone who could was doing their part. The Jewish community in Ottawa had the highest enlistment rate in all of Canada, with 49% of the male Jewish population enlisting in some form of military service. By the end of the war, 598 individuals had enlisted and served. Almost everyone knew someone serving overseas, with many families having multiple sons serving alongside one another, and in some cases, fathers and sons. One story in particular that I really enjoy is that of the Toller brothers, Norman, Archie, and Morton. So all three were enlisted, with Morton in the Royal Canadian Air Force and Norman and Archie in the Royal Canadian Army Medical Corps. When men enlisted, they were generally kept in separate units from their family, which was the case with these three. However, in February of 1942, the brothers all found themselves in the same area in England and had a very quick one-night reunion in a pub before continuing on their way. All three brothers did return at the end of the war and went on to own and operate the very well-known Albert's Meat Market. Involvement in the Second World War, of course, didn't just stop with the men on the front lines. Those back home did their part as well. There were a number of organizations that rallied to support their troops, such as the Canadian Hadassah. This was the organization that Mrs. Lillian Freeman had founded and served as president on. With the declaration of war, Lillian actually telegraphed the Prime Minister and personally offered her and her organization services to help with the war effort. Funds were made available for the purchase of ambulances, and they provided blankets as well as a number of other services. In other areas in the city, war workrooms were opened for women to come in and knit or sew items to be sent overseas. One woman in particular, Goldie Roberts, whom many referred to as the mother of all Jewish servicemen in Ottawa, greeted war relief parcels. Her parcels were delivered to servicemen with a carton of cigarettes and a tag labeled "Some Jewish Ladies in Ottawa." Others joined the ranks of nurses. Frida Swedlove, later Lithwick, joined the army to become a nurse, and in 6 weeks had earned the title of First Lieutenant Nursing Sister. There are many, many veterans in the Jewish community, men and women alike. Far too many for me to list in entirety here, even though I would absolutely adore to. But for anyone who is interested in learning a little bit more about Ottawa's Jewish veterans, there is a book available through the Greenberg Family's Library and for viewing through the archives called There I Was. This was an initiative by the Ottawa Post of Jewish War Veterans in the late 1990s, spearheaded by Frida Lithwick, who I just mentioned. And this book is a collection of reminiscences of Ottawa's Jewish servicemen who served and fought during the Second World War. After the Second World War, the Jewish community really took off. From 1945 to 1975, the population doubled in size and as a result, needed more space. Plans for the development of a Jewish community center commenced in 1943 with Mr. A.J. Freeman, Lillian's husband and Moses' son-in-law, really is the driving force behind this. As a side note, for anyone who's interested or who may know, AJ owned Freeman's department store, which at one time was one of the largest, if not the largest department store in Ottawa. If I'm remembering correctly, it was where the old Bay used to be, attached to Rideau Center. But to get back on track, AJ really wanted a space where everybody could gather, a place for those who were serving overseas to come home to and to thrive. His vision was not just of a community center, but a center where people, school, prayer, leisure would all come together as one. Fundraising began in that year with AJ pledging $25,000 of the $125,000 goal. This is in 1943. With the help of the two synagogues, Adat Yeshurun and Agudath Achim, $350,000 were raised, well over the intended goal. Unfortunately, AJ did not get to see the JCC built. He passed away on June 4th, 1944, a few years after Lillian had passed. The Jewish Community Center was completed and opened in 1951 and became the city's first JCC. Today, it's most commonly known as the Chapel Street JCC, simply because there is a different one today, and this one was located on Chapel Street. So this building was built in 3 stages, finally completed in 1960 with the Beth Shalom Synagogue, Talmud Torah, and a gymnasium as later additions. For many, the JCC became the center of Jewish life, with classes, gyms, community meetings, and of course, a synagogue all being in one spot together. The addition of the Beth Shalom congregation welcomed nearly 850 families, with the inauguration on Rosh Hashanah in 1956. So as the community began to grow, so did the need for expansion. Jewish families were no longer just living in the lower town areas. Many had started to move west in Ottawa, with new synagogues opening up to accommodate the movement. In 1983, the Jewish day school, known as Hillel Academy, purchased the old St. Joseph High School on Broadview Avenue. It opened up plans for a future move for the community center. With so many families moving westward, it made sense to build in a more central, accessible location where everybody could get to. In 1988, additional land around the school was purchased, which would aid in creating the Ottawa Jewish Community Campus. 10 years later, on September 13th, 1998, the Soloway Jewish Community Center opened its doors to the community for the first time. Today, the SJCC is located just off of Carling Avenue, and the campus consists of the OJCS, which is the school, Hillel Lodge, which is a retirement community, another school, daycare center, and of course, the Jewish Community Center building where the archives is located. And just for anyone who's interested, if you look at the photo on the top of the screen, there is a center building with a large Star of David window. That is where the archives is located. Today, the Jewish community in Ottawa is thriving. We have just over 14,000 Jews living in the city, making up 1.4% of Ottawa's total population. It may be small, but it sure is mighty. I say this constantly, but this community is so closely knit. Everybody knows everybody, and just as we've seen with its past, there is no hesitation when support is required. This past year, the Jewish Federation of Ottawa launched an emergency campaign to help fund those who needed it during the pandemic, and $2.7 million was raised and distributed to those who needed it. This was on top of the annual campaign. A Jewish Ottawa Helps Facebook page was created to help those who needed it, and overnight, close to 1,000 people joined the group, simply asking, what can we do to help? This community has always supported each other, and as a result, has created this flourishing presence in the city. Almost everyone has some memory of a Jewish business, person, or organization who has affected them along the way. And I really think that is a testament to this community's influence on our amazing city. So thank you all for listening. I think I managed to fit about 160 years of history into 15 minutes. So now what we're going to do is jump back a little bit in time, and Marijke is going to tell us about businesses and food in the Jewish community.
Wonderful. There is a snowplow outside my window, so you may or may not hear that. But many, if not all of you, are familiar with the Byward Market. For some of you, this might be the market of the 1970s, with the smell of fresh Rideau Bakery rye wafting down the street. For others, it's the market of 2021, with the smell of beaver tails and face masks. For the Jewish community in Ottawa, the Byward Market and Lower Town neighborhood are intimately linked with community heritage. In the late 19th and early 20th century, many Jewish newcomers settled in Lower Town because of affordable housing and the proximity to the commercial hub that was the Byward Market. In those days, there was no such thing as a 5-day work week. So, what do you do if you want to observe the Sabbath, a day of rest and abstinence from work? You become a peddler. Peddlers had to purchase a cart, purchase goods, and go from door to door trying to sell those goods. Successful peddlers could earn enough money to purchase a store in the Byward Market area. Lazarus Greenberg remembered one fine day on December 12th. In 1915, he got his license from City Hall for $10, set himself up with a wholesaler, got a suitcase with $15 worth of merchandise, and started knocking on doors in Lower Town. Though Greenberg continued knocking on those doors for 30 years, some people, like Jacob and Leah Rivers, started by renting a fruit and vegetable stand. After a few years, the Rivers had enough money to open J. Rivers Fruits in Byward Market. These businesses that grew up from cart or stand became family businesses. Irving Rivers, the son of Jacob and Leah Rivers, would wake up early in the morning to go with his father to purchase produce from local farmers. These early years of working with his father fostered a love for the market that continued for the rest of his life. Irving Rivers, or Mr. Market, was president of the Byward Market Merchants Association, was honored with the distinction of Tourism Ambassador from the Government of Canada, and was awarded the Gilbert Greenberg Distinctive Service Award in recognition for his contributions to the Jewish community. Many Jewish youth worked for their parents' businesses, just like Irving. However, it wasn't always easy. For Harry Fine's daughter, Sarah, working for the family business was the last thing she wanted to do. Sarah started working as a file clerk for her father's fruit business at 16. Her brother David took pity on her and fired her every day so she could go have fun with her friends. But every morning, her father always hired her back again. Between the 1920s and 1940s, Jews made up about 1.92% of the general population in Ottawa and about 70% of the population in Lower Town. Everyone knew everyone, and every business was a community business. Thelma and Nathan Steinman ran Economy Dairy in the Byward Market for 38 years. Thelma, who also received the Gilbert Greenberg Distinguished Service Award, recounts that they were able to run their store and send 3 children to university by filling the shelves of their grocery dairy with what the community asked for. Similar to Economy Dairy, Albert's Meat Market knew the needs and the whims of the community. Archie and Mort Toller knew exactly how a T-bone would sell on a Thursday and stocked their shelves accordingly. But no store is more integrated into the fabric of a community than the Rideau Bakery. When we reached out to the community over social media about a food that holds special significance in their family, the response was overwhelmingly Rideau Bakery rye. People remember the smell, the warmth, the freshness of the rye. They remember it soaking up gravy or how it tasted with smoked meat. They remember the sweet treats, the pastry, the egg loaf, and the pumpernickel breads. There is even a story of a federal government official posing at the Great Wall of China with a salami sandwich made of Rito Bakery rye. Louis Cardish, pictured here smiling behind the counter, explained that the secret to their bread is careful attention. Attention to both process and heritage. Since the rye bread is sourdough based, every new day's bread is made with a bit of the starter from the day before. Each time your hands work the dough, he says, you are making a connection with family many years gone by. The Cardish family had been connecting to their sourdough roots for nearly 90 years when the kosher bakery closed in 2019. The closing of this iconic bakery was a heavy blow to the Jewish community in Ottawa. In fact, this was just one in a series of community staple closures that began in the early 1970s with the establishment of the Rideau Center and the growth of the Jewish community. In 1998, when the Soloway JCC opened, and around the same time, an increasing number of grocery stores and meat outlets carried kosher foods. Though you can still buy Rideau Bakery rye from the local Farm Boy grocery store, the sense of community is not the same. But not the same does not necessarily mean worse. Those peddlers who worked so hard to send their children to university have succeeded in building a strong, capable, highly adaptable, and continuous community in the heart of Ottawa. So why am I focusing on food vendors when so many Jewish merchants in the Byward Market were also furriers, tailors, furniture dealers, shoe repairers, and jewelers? Well, for every butcher shop, dairy, bakery, and grocer I mentioned here, there are 20 more that I haven't talked about. And we haven't even discussed the delis. Food has a significant place in every culture, but for the Jewish community who operate with dietary laws, the significance of food is elevated. Not every butcher was kosher, nor was every bakery. Jewish immigrants who settled in towns outside Ottawa would bus or drive almost 110 kilometers to pick up kosher meat from United Kosher Meat and Deli, bread from the Rideau Bakery, and matzah from Farber's grocery store. In the words of Claudia Roden, author of The Book of Jewish Food, dishes are important because they are a link with the past, a celebration of roots, a symbol of continuity. They are that part of an immigrant culture which survives the longest, kept up even when clothing, music, language, and religious observance have been abandoned. Cooking is transmitted in every family like genes, and it has the capacity for change and for passing on new experience from one generation to another. When life resumes in a new normal, you can connect to this incredible heritage. When the Byward Market is again filled with stalls of farmers selling fresh fruit and vegetables, maybe you will be reminded of the Jewish families that started peddling 100 years ago on the very street you stand. Irving Rivers believed that the market was alive, and you can see it. In fact, you might even be able to taste it. Thank you.
So that concludes our presentation. Thank you everyone so much for listening. Before we move on, before we move on to the discussion section, we just wanted to take a moment to say a few words. So for anyone who is interested in learning more about the Jewish community and its history, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. I am available through email at archives@jewishottawa.com and occasionally, due to the pandemic, by phone at 613-798-4696 at extension 260. I believe those are in the chat function for anyone who would like them. You can also learn more about the history of Jewish Ottawa through the book A Common Thread. This is the one that's up on the screen right now. This was a community initiative put together by the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society and a couple of community members in the early 2000s, and it's a collection written by community members outlining our history. I know Mareike and I both heavily use this book for the presentation, and besides being a wealth of memory and knowledge, it features many, many more photos from the archives than were actually used in this presentation. So if anyone would like a copy, please don't hesitate again to reach out to me. I'm happy to get that going for you. All right, let me stop sharing my screen.
That was fantastic.
Yeah.
That was great. Thank you so much for that brilliant presentation.
Oh, of course.
Smoked meat on rye wouldn't be too bad right now.
Yeah, I'm quite hungry.
Yeah.
That's neat.
Some
So
gravy.
again, just to reiterate, there are some links to check out in the chat, some links for the Jewish Archives, and if you want to get in touch with them, if you have any questions or anything like that, the phone number and the email as well. So again, thank you very much for that fantastic presentation, both of you. It's the amount and the quality and the significance of the photos you shared. It really brings the community to life right in front of you. It's quite astonishing.
We're very lucky. We have a huge photograph collection, and I mean,
What might
everything
you
was
say
captured.
enormous.
Enormous is a better word for it. But yeah, we're very lucky to have what we do have.
Yeah. Now, Meredith and I have some questions, so we can get our discussion going. So let's get right into it. I think I'll start us off. So we're just curious, what do you think has been the most enduring legacy of the Jewish community's contribution to the development of Ottawa as we know it today?
It's a good question. This is going to sound a little cheesy, but honestly, it's just the community's presence. I mean, I said it, Marika said it, everyone knows everyone. Everyone has some kind of memory of a Jewish business or has been impacted by some type of Jewish organization, person, what have you. This community has just contributed simply by being present and in this city. The Byward Market, I know we've talked about it already, but it's a fantastic example of this, in a sense that, you know, in a way, the market was built on Jews. It was where their businesses were, their homes were around the corner. And today, the market is just such a huge tourist attraction that you can't really stand anywhere in the market without standing on the history of the Jewish community. So yeah, I think the enduring legacy is just its presence here.
Yeah, it's certainly you can't really get more essential Ottawa than the Byward Market, eh?
Absolutely.
It's such a core part of the city and its history.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, speaking as someone who works at the Bytown Museum, Lower Town and the development of the market is just so essential to the history we present. It's really interesting to see it carry through all the way through the different communities in Ottawa and its
Absolutely.
history.
Well, and every community has had a hand in the market, but definitely we have our stamp in it too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and building on what you and Steve have been talking about, we do have the Byward Market. You're saying, you know, everybody knows someone who's been impacted by this community, but it seems like a lot of it is hidden in plain sight. So for those of us who watched your presentation, are there any more tangible reminders that we can find of this community in Ottawa, something that we can see today?
Absolutely. So we're pretty lucky that there are still a number of significant buildings that are still standing. First and foremost, everybody just saw the slides with Adith Jeshurun. That building is still standing, still in the original spot, still looks exactly the same. That big, beautiful Star of David window is still up at the top. They never took it down when the Seventh-day Adventist group took it over. So that's really a tangible piece of our history. You know, you can walk up, you can look at it, you can touch the building if you want. And as far as I know, the group who owns it is fairly friendly about letting people come in and just, you know, experience the history. Because as far as I'm aware, maybe don't quote me on this, the interior still looks fairly the same. There's that, and then going to bring it back to the market again. Like I said, you can't walk through the market without touching a piece of Jewish history. The number of buildings in there that were owned by Jewish business owners but have changed hands, they're still standing. You can still walk into a store, and if you know the history behind it, you can say, this was Jewish owned once upon a time. Maybe it still is.
It's all around us. It's amazing.
Absolutely.
And there's, I think, just recently, you know, sort of tangible things you can see. I think it was a pedestrian bridge in Ottawa.
Yes.
Was just named after former Mayor Jackie Holtzman.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't really get more tangible than concrete and cement. So yeah. I found that a pretty good recent example as well.
Absolutely. And I didn't realize that bridge was going up until, you know, I was driving to work one day on the 417, went, oh my gosh, that's Jackie.
And now, in your opinion, what seems to be the most significant and overlooked aspect of Jewish history in Ottawa? And I think overlooked might be the sort of imperative word in that sentence.
Yes. So that's a big question, just because everybody has something different that they would answer to it. I've actually asked this a couple times to a few different people, and it seems to be the one thing that keeps popping up is its presence. You know, the fact that this community is here and it is so deeply ingrained in Ottawa history. I myself lived in the city for about a year and a half, and it wasn't until I got hired and started working at the archives that I realized, you know, just how incredible this history is and this community is. They're in now all aspects. They're everywhere, and I think sometimes, myself included, it gets overlooked. Pardon me, I'm choking on words. But I think that would probably be the most overlooked aspect, is just the fact that we're here and that we're so ingrained in Ottawa history.
Speaking again, just to bring up another little personal thought I had. I mean, and again, to sort of, I think naturally, because I work there, link it to the Bytown for a second.
Of course.
When in the middle of winter, like we are now, the stairs leading down to the Rideau Canal locks where the Bytown Museum is, those are usually obviously closed off for safety reasons. Those are usually the easiest ways to get down there. But in the middle of winter, like we are now, the easiest way to get down there, we usually recommend to people, is taking Lawrence Freeman Lane, next to the and behind the NAC. And you know, I confess, to me, it was just another road to go down and just another road to take to get to work. And so, you know, when you hear about the history of the family and the impact they had on the city, sort of puts that little lane in a whole new light, you know. And you don't get I think you don't get a lane at the NAC named after you without having contributed quite a bit to the cultural fabric of this city. So that was sort of a little thought there on that overlooked aspect, and personally overlooked in my case, I fully admit.
It's just like the bridge, right? You walk down the street one day and all of a sudden you go, oh my gosh, there's a piece of that history.
Yeah.
So much of it seems like it's being concentrated in organizations like yours. You know, the Ottawa Jewish Archives has a really big role in preserving it and presenting this history. But for the history community and just Ottawans in general, it seems like it's so hidden, like I said earlier, in plain sight. Do you have any suggestions that these communities in the broader sense can properly appreciate the contributions of the Jewish community in Ottawa and their legacy?
Absolutely. One of the easiest things to do is just talk about it. Everybody has a story. Like I've said, everybody has some kind of connection to a person, business, organization, what have you. And one of the easiest things to do to just, you know, appreciate this community and its roots and its stories is to tell the stories, immerse yourselves in them. Another thing is just knowing where you are. I know in heritage, a really big thing is land acknowledgements, which we did at the beginning, understanding the land that you stand on and the history behind it. That goes for the buildings in this city as well. You know, you don't have to do it for every building, but maybe every once in a while when you're going through the Byward Market, for example, stop and read the plaque, see who owned it, see what's involved, and just immerse yourself in it. History is everywhere in everything we touch, and the easiest way is just to look into it yourself. I will also put in a plug and say visiting the archives does not hurt.
Exactly. And I like that you're saying telling the stories, because oral history like that is a really accessible way to transmit some of these histories, and it can be part of so many parts of everyday life. So I really like that.
Absolutely.
And in fact, I think I'll go to the chat for a second, actually, because a little while ago, Trina posted a little bit of a story in the chat. She says, my late father used to tell tales of going with his father in the late 1930s to the market every Saturday morning. My grandfather would visit with Mr. Zelikovitz and frequent the fruit and vegetable peddlers. And the stories of the Italian and Jewish families are so very familiar. So speaking of telling the stories and sharing the stories and living them, you know, thank you very much for that contribution, Trina. We really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And coming from an Italian family myself, I can absolutely identify with that. And I would also, remind everyone watching right now, if you have some stories to share, don't hesitate. We'd love to hear them. And we have more people interacting in the chat right now. That's fantastic. I do have one more question.
Yes, please.
Sort of following on that idea of how people can appreciate the history and learn about it. We're just curious what organizations and resources exist for viewers to learn more about this history. And obviously, in particular, can you tell us more about your organization, the mandate and some of the projects you're working on?
Absolutely. So first and foremost, the easiest way to find out is, of course, the archives. I believe we are the biggest Jewish history center in the city. So if you ever have any questions, family, business, who owned my house, who owned my business, tell me a bit about grandpa. We're really there to help with that. And I love getting research requests. So I'm always happy to help with anything. Another really great one is the Ottawa Jewish Bulletin website. So the Ottawa Jewish Bulletin was the oldest Jewish newspaper in Ottawa. It unfortunately just closed at the beginning of this year. But this paper has been running since the 30s, and they have everything that went on in the community. And we were actually lucky enough in 2016 to have an archivist with a lot of drive, and she managed to get every single copy of the bulletin digitized and up online. So this is a searchable database. It's keyword search too. It makes your life way easier. So that's a really great source just for looking up any kind of history involved with the Jewish community, just because it's a newspaper, they were reporting on stuff. The Canadian Jewish Heritage Network is another great one. This is an online database for all Canadian Jewish heritage centers. Myself included is a part of it. We have a very small portion of our collection up there. New things get uploaded every month. And it's a really great way to just see what we have to offer without necessarily having to come in or contact me initially. And as well to see what Canada has in terms of their own Jewish communities. The last one I'll bring up is the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society, who is very near and dear to my heart. They are a huge supporter of the archives. They actually were there, and I believe they helped start the archives back in the 60s. They're a huge support to us, both through physical assistance as well as grants. And every person on that board is a wealth of knowledge as well. So just to tell you a little bit about the archives, as you mentioned, I won't read you our full mandate simply because it's very long-winded. But basically the gist of it is that we collect anything that pertains to Jewish Ottawa. We don't take items or papers that pertain to just Ottawa. We don't take anything that pertains to just Judaism. It has to be Ottawa Jewish based. We serve our Jewish community. We tell their stories. That's pretty much our purpose. So the archives began sometime in 1969 with our founder and very first archivist, Mrs. Shirley Berman, who we are very, very grateful to. Shirley ended up coming up from the GTA, actually very close to where I grew up, with her husband Shire. And she realized that not a lot of the history was being preserved. And so she decided to do something about it. And she actually created the archives on her kitchen table. And she started just working in her home, collecting. Eventually they moved to the Chapel Street JCC. And then finally they ended up where we are today in the current Soloway Jewish Community Center. Our collection is filled with more than 25,000 records, thanks to a number of different archivists over the years who have made it their mission in life to make sure that we have a well-rounded history and we represent as many as we possibly can. In terms of what we've really got going on, we have a couple projects right now. Thanks to the generosity of the Ottawa Jewish Historical Society, the archives has an intern right now who is digitizing our oral history audio cassette collection. This is a set of 5 full boxes of audio cassettes. They were taken in the 90s to late 90s, early 2000s, and they are oral histories of people in the community just telling their story, their immigration story, their war years, what it was like growing up in Ottawa, who their teachers were. It's an incredible wealth of knowledge, and I'm very excited to be able to have these digitized so that we can ensure the longevity of these stories so that future generations can listen to them many years from now. We also have another podcast episode coming soon. We are 613 Archives for anybody who's interested. That will be released sometime in June. I am not giving away the topic. You will have to tune in to find out. And finally, of course, we have our wonderful Marika, who is my intern right now from Fleming College. She's working on our photograph collection, and I think she can speak better to what she's doing than I can.
Thanks, Deacon. The Ottawa Jewish Archives have an incredible amount of photographs from very, very early to contemporary photos. And what I'm doing is surveying the collection, seeing what's needed, and making a plan so that they can be preserved for 500 years. So each and every one of you can come and have a chance to take a look.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for doing that work. Both of you, obviously. Archives are doing a fantastic job preserving and conserving this history. We really appreciate that. And as we mentioned before, and as people might have seen before in the chat, further up the chat, we had some links that people could check out, and of course, the email for the archives and the phone number as well, if people want to get in touch and have some questions to ask. And indeed, although I'm sure we could go on and on in this discussion, we do have some audience members who have asked some questions. So if we're ready, we can move on to addressing some of the audience contributions. I'd like to start actually with Katrina. Katrina actually has 3 questions, if we can address those. So first, how would you compare the history of the Ottawa Jewish community to Jewish communities in other comparable sized cities? So Edmonton, Calgary, or anything like that. Are there similar patterns of people starting as peddlers, for example? Just a curious question there.
That's a good question. Unfortunately, I can't speak much to that. At the moment, my scope of knowledge is very much Ottawa based. I don't know too much about the other ones, but if you're really wanting to know, please feel free to send me an email. I am happy to look into this and see what we can come up with, and we can go from there.
Fantastic. And speaking of on Ottawa in particular, is it distinct from other Canadian cities, or it is distinct from other Canadian cities because of the presence of the federal government? And could you speak to the extent, is the evolution of the Jewish community in Ottawa linked with the growth of the federal government? And perhaps how is that community affected by anti-Semitism embodied in federal policy, for example?
Big questions. Absolutely. I think they are definitely linked to the growth of the federal government. I can't name any off the top of my head, but I know quite a few people who were civil servants. They worked in the government. And in some cases, there are mentions of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, unfortunately, isn't spoken about as enough as much as it should be sometimes. It tends to get swept under the rug because it's, some people find it uncomfortable to talk about. But I know it does happen. There is, I'm trying to figure out how to answer this without giving away stuff with my podcast episode. But there is a story in particular, which if you listen to the podcast episode in June, that will talk a little bit about this, where the creation of a certain organization was wanting to be done. They were finding it difficult to get this going. They believed a little bit because of anti-Semitism. There tended to be Catholic versions of this, whereas they were not allowing Jewish versions of this. So it's definitely prevalent. It definitely made an impact and a difference in some cases, but for the most part, people do find a way around it. I know there was one case, this isn't necessarily linked to this time period, but back in the 30s, there's the Tissot case. If anyone knows about this, this was I believe it was a police officer, very anti-Semitic. He really wanted to get A.J. Freeman out of his building and put non-Jews in there, and he decided to try and poke at all of the other business owners and try and get everyone against him, and it really backfired on him very quickly because A.J. Freeman was so well known in the community that it just didn't pan out. So I hope that answers your question. I definitely went a little off the rails for a minute there.
That's great. And finally, has the Ottawa Jewish community experienced a lot of assimilation? And has there been any trends or experiencing the competing trends of greater secularization and growing orthodoxy that you see in other cities in North America? The assimilation question in particular is an interesting one.
These are good questions. Oh my goodness. Is the community experiencing secularization? I don't know how much I can speak to that either, simply because I'm not particularly religious. But in terms of Orthodoxy, I know that during the 60s and 70s, there was a bit of a split because there was mostly just Orthodox synagogues in the city. And, you know, times were starting to change. People wanted a little more liberal views. And quite a few synagogues ended up being created as a result of that. So there was a bit of a break in secularization in that sense.
Yeah, fair enough. Trina also asks, when you reference records, do they pertain to stories, photos, those sorts of records we're talking about, those sort of tangible ones?
Sorry, say that again.
When you reference records specifically, do they pertain to stories and photos on paper? You obviously mentioned the cassettes as well, the oral history.
It can be a number of things. The archives has a ton of different kinds of records. A lot of our biggest collection in terms of records is organizations. So that usually ends up being financial reports, meeting minutes, you know, receipts, that kind of thing. So in terms of that, although it doesn't necessarily tell a story, you can create one from what you're looking at. Meeting minutes, as boring as we all think they are an absolute wealth of knowledge. I have used them so many times for figuring out where a person was in the city at the time, who was on a specific committee, when a name change occurred, who was present, what the date was, what decisions happened. And just by looking at all of these little pieces, you can start to create a full story out of facts.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet it must be a varied collection of everything. And I mean, I guess, you know, when you're collecting a lot of local history, you're going to get people bringing in books, papers,
Oh yeah,
recordings. From Andrea, and I think this kind of ties in, you mentioned, or we mentioned in a question and in an answer, the issue of anti-Semitism. Andrea posted a comment, Jewish immigrants were peddlers because no one wanted to hire Jews, which wouldn't be surprising back then, unfortunately.
Yes, unfortunately, that is a part of the history that it does play another big part. You know, with all immigration groups, and to some extent anyways, there was racism, there was anti-Semitism. A lot of the time people did not want to associate, they didn't want to hire. I have found a lot of the time though that some of the stories are a little more positive. Obviously, the Jewish community rallied behind itself and, you know, they became a force to reckon with. And I would say, again, AJ Freeman is such a great example of this with the Tissot case, where someone was trying to defame him, and the rest of the community who were not Jewish said, no, we're not going to put up with that, because this is a great person who is so ingrained in this community, who has done so much for us, and is has such a huge business and is a huge part. They didn't let it happen, and he won out in the end. So it's definitely there. It's definitely prevalent. You can't ignore it. But there are a lot of good stories where, you know, the good wins out.
Yeah. And real quick, just one little question, and then I'm going to get to one other story that was posted. Dale, how about audio with music? Do you have any music in the?
Ooh, that's a great question. We have records, like the old vinyls. Yeah. I haven't had the chance to go through them yet and see what's on them. We do have a record player, pardon me. We do have a record player, and we do have an entire case of vinyls. So we do have some stuff, a lot of sheet music. Of course, we had a lot of music groups in synagogues, so we have a lot of that. But if you're wanting like actual audio, records would be the big one that we have.
Yeah. And this story, so from Lisa, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I have to agree that oral history oral history, excuse me, is extremely important in the passing on of our community's history. My brothers and I were regularly told stories about my mother's family and their achievements. Her father was the first Jewish baby born in Ottawa. That's wow. He was educated at McGill and became the head of the Department of Gynecology at the Civic, as well as the city coroner. My grandfather on my father's side emigrated from Russia and started life in the Ottawa area as a peddler and went on to become an established businessman. My parents were very proud of their heritage, as are my brothers and I, as I think you should be. That's
absolutely
history.
For Lisa, I could be wrong here, is your father's name Harry?
Ooh. Dr. Chronic.
Regardless, pardon?
This might be a perfect opportunity actually to check out the links that we posted earlier with the email and the phone numbers. I would highly recommend that. If Lisa, I was told that my father was not admitted because of the number of Jews. Wow. There we go, another example of anti-Semitism, unfortunately. Dale, my father led the choir for 30 years at Beth Shalom. Whew,
oh, wow.
Recordings. Wow. Huh. This is fantastic. Now, but unfortunately, because we are coming up on our 1 hour mark, I don't want to keep everyone too long. But I think the stories and the questions we've gotten so far have been fantastic. And it just shows what you and Marika have been explaining to us all night, which is that importance of continuing that community history, continuing that knowledge of the past, and how that shapes the future and how that shapes our times as well. So unfortunately, because we are coming up to the end of our hour, if you do have any other questions or any comments or any stories you'd like to share with Tegan, with Marika, or with us, I'd be really interested in hearing some of these stories as well myself, personally. Please check out, again, we have the email and the phone number in the chat for the archives, and I'm sure Tegan and Marika would love to hear from you.
Absolutely.
But for now, I'd like to say thank you. As I said with the discussion, I think we could go on for hours and hours. But we really appreciate your presence here tonight, Tegan and Marika, and your hard work for helping to make this possible tonight. Thank you again also to our amazing staff member, Meredith, who has not stopped working as hard as ever to help get this series up and running. And thank you to our Manager of Revenue and Operations, Rebecca Webb, who has, she is responsible for the smooth hosting of tonight's talk on Zoom. And thank you as well to our Marketing and Communications Manager, Matt, without whom not many people would have had this talk brought to their attention. And it would have been a pretty quiet night, I think, for all of us here. So thank you, Matt. And if you're interested in more Bytown content, we will be continuing our series on March 24th with a talk on the Black history of Ottawa. And coming up much sooner, however, is our Women Museum Leaders Roundtable on March 4th. That is next Thursday. Our own Executive Director, Robin Etherington, will be moderating an online panel discussion with 5 other leaders from around Canada representing museums and art galleries, science center, and they will all be speaking to current and future challenges our cultural and education institutions face. So the sign up to attend our roundtable and future talks can be found on our museum's homepage at bytownmuseum.ca. And while you're there, be sure to check out some other online programming, our crafts and videos, and you can even have a stroll over to the membership page perhaps to sign up as a museum member. And as always, we are extraordinarily grateful for any donations, big or small. So with that, I will say thank you again to Tegan and Marika. Thank you to my colleagues at the Bytown, and thank you to everyone for attending tonight. We really appreciate it. We hope you enjoyed this fantastic talk, and I hope you all have a wonderful evening. And please stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.